The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound that dared to challenge the resonant baritone of Marcus Lockwood. At the head of a dining table laden with a fortune in crystal and Belgian linen, he was not merely a man having dinner. He was a king holding court. His throne was carved from mahogany, his kingdom built of stocks, bonds, and the unshakable certainty of his own importance. To his right sat his wife, Eleanor, a woman whose smile was as polished and brittle as the glaze on the china. To his left, his son, Julian, smirked into his wine glass, a pale, indolent echo of his father's arrogance. And across from them, next to his own wife, sat Ethan Vance. Ethan was an island of stillness in the turbulent sea of Lockwood confidence. He ate with a quiet deliberation that they mistook for timidity. He listened with a focused attention they interpreted as awe. For 2 years since he had married their daughter, Ava, this had been his role at their table. The silent, unassuming guest, the necessary but slightly embarrassing accessory to their beautiful, ambitious daughter. The key to the Meridian Project, Marcus was saying, gesturing with a silver fish knife, is not simply the acquisition. Anyone can buy land. The art is in the leverage, the vision to see not what is there, but what will be there. He looked down the table, his gaze sweeping past Ethan as if he were a piece of furniture. It's about legacy, something our family understands. Julian chimed in, his voice slick with inherited pride. We're not just building a tower, we're erecting a monument. The Lockwood name will be etched into the city's skyline for a century. Ethan felt Ava shift beside him, a subtle tension in her shoulders, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. She was a part of their world, born of its polished surfaces and ruthless expectations. She loved Ethan, he believed that, but she was also ashamed of him, ashamed of his quiet nature, his modest architectural firm, his refusal to play the games of status and dominance that were second nature to her family. Marcus then turned his attention to a detail of the deal, a particularly clever bit of financial maneuvering that had allowed him to secure a critical parcel of land. He lowered his voice, leaning conspiratorially toward his son and wife. Ava leaned in too, drawn into the tight circle of family power. Ethan continued to eat his sea base, his expression unreadable. He saw the flicker in Ava's eyes as she glanced at him, a brief assessment to ensure he was sufficiently disengaged, lost in his own simple thoughts. Satisfied, she turned back to her father. She leaned closer, her hand resting on the back of Marcus's chair, her voice a breathy whisper meant only for the inner circle. But the zoning variance, Dad? Is it really secure? What if the council reviews it? She murmured, her brow furrowed with a daughter's concern for her father's empire. Marcus gave a dismissive wave of his hand, a gesture that brushed away building codes and city councils like breadcrumbs. A formality. The preliminary designs are so compelling, so inevitable. They'll push it through. Besides, he added, his voice dropping even lower, his eyes gleaming with secret knowledge, our consultant on the inside has assured me it's a done deal. He thinks the original architect was a fool, left millions in potential value on the table. Ava's shoulders relaxed. A relieved smile touched her lips. She glanced at Ethan again, who was now carefully placing his knife and fork together on his plate, the meal finished. She gave her father a final, reassuring look and whispered the words that would echo in the sudden silence of the room for an eternity. It's fine. He'll never know. The words were a ghost, a wisp of sound, but in the cathedral-like quiet of Ethan's focus, they were a thunderclap. He, the fool architect, the man whose vision was being dismantled and plundered. He'll never know. The implicit pact of her deception, the casual betrayal shared with her father, hung in the air between them. Ethan did not look at her. He did not react with the hurt or anger she might have expected, had she believed him capable of even understanding the conversation. Instead, he placed his hands in his lap. The gentle scrape of his chair as he adjusted his position was a tectonic shift in the room's atmosphere. Everyone felt it. Julian looked up from his wine, a question in his eyes. Eleanor's polished smile faltered. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan raised his head, His gaze did not land on his wife, the silent enabler. It bypassed her completely, traveling the length of the opulent table to lock directly onto the king in his mahogany throne. Marcus Lockwood, caught off guard by the sheer force of the stare, raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind, Ethan? Cat got your tongue? Or did the fish disagree with you?" The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. Ava's breath hitched. She felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, a primal fear that the careful illusion of her life was about to shatter. She wanted to reach out, to touch Ethan's arm, to silence him before he could speak, before he could embarrass himself, and by extension, her. But she was too late. Ethan's voice, when it came, was not loud. It was calm, measured, and devastatingly clear. It cut through the room's expensive perfume and simmering condescension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He spoke 4 words. "The foundation is compromised." He said nothing more. He simply held Marcus's gaze. The phrase, an architectural term, was also a metaphor of such brutal perfection that it sucked the air from the room. It was an indictment, a prophecy, a statement of fact. Ava went white. The color drained from her face as if a plug had been pulled, leaving behind a waxy, translucent mask of horror. Her eyes, wide and terrified, darted from her husband to her father. "He'll never know." The words mocked her, screamed in the sudden, ringing silence. He knew. He had always known. The fool. The modest architect. The man she had just so casually dismissed, so easily betrayed. Marcus stared back, his mind, so quick with numbers and leverage, struggling to process the attack. He saw it not as information, but as an affront, a bizarre and insolent comment from a help. "What on earth are you talking about?" he scoffed, trying to reclaim his authority. "The foundation is solid granite. The best money can buy." Ethan's gaze remained unwavering. "Is it, Marcus?" he asked, the quiet question carrying more weight than all of Marcus's blustering pronouncements. And in that moment, Ava knew. She knew that the man she had married was not the man she had presented to her family. The quiet, humble man was a facade, and the life she had built was a house of cards. The foundation was compromised, and the collapse was just beginning. We've all felt it, haven't we? That sting of being underestimated, of being dismissed by people who think they know our worth better than we do. It's a universal feeling, a quiet anger that builds inside. If you've ever wished for a moment of vindication like this one, let me know with a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back and see just how deep this compromise goes and how long Ethan has been waiting for this moment. The humiliation had not begun that night. It had been a slow, steady erosion of dignity, a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts, administered with the casual cruelty of the truly arrogant. Their wedding had been the first battleground. The Lockwoods had paid for everything, a fact Eleanor mentioned at every opportunity, her voice dripping with the sweet poison of manufactured generosity. "We just wanted Ava to have the best," she would say, her eyes flicking to Ethan, the unspoken addendum hanging in the air. The best of everything but her choice of husband. Ethan's parents, a retired teacher and a librarian from a quiet Midwestern town, had been treated with a polite, chilling condescension. Marcus had spent 10 minutes explaining the complexities of his investment portfolio to Ethan's father, who had simply smiled and said, "That sounds fascinating. I just finished a wonderful biography of John Maynard Keynes. Have you read it?" Marcus had stared at him blankly before turning away, dismissing him as a simpleton. Ethan had proposed to Ava with a simple, elegant platinum ring holding a single, flawless sapphire. It was her birthstone. He had spent months searching for the perfect stone, one that matched the unique shade of her eyes. On her finger, it was a quiet statement of profound, personal love. The day after the engagement, Eleanor had taken Ava to a private jeweler, emerging with a diamond the size of a small asteroid. "A family ring," she had announced, slipping it onto Ava's other hand. "It's more appropriate for the Lockwood standard." Ava, caught in the crossfire, had begun wearing both, a walking symbol of her divided loyalties. But the true heart of their disdain was Ethan's career. He was an architect. In their world, this was a trade, not a profession. It was something one hired, not something one was. He ran a small, two-person firm with his old college roommate, David Chun. They called it Vance and Chin Design. The Lockwoods called it Ethan's little hobby. 6 months before the fateful dinner, at a summer barbecue at the Lockwood estate, the humiliation had reached a particular peak. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and grilled shrimp. Marcus was showing off a new scale model of a proposed luxury condominium complex. "The architects are competent," Marcus had said, waving a dismissive hand at the model. "But they lack flair, audacity. You see this central courtyard? A waste of prime real estate. I told them to tear it out, add another 10 units. Julian, holding a gin and tonic, had laughed. "Flair is not in their vocabulary, Dad. They're draftsmen with a fancy title." He then turned to Ethan, who had been quietly observing the model from a few feet away. "What do you think, Ethan? You're in the building business. You must have an opinion." The emphasis was designed to mock, to place Ethan's work on the same level as a carpenter or a plumber. Ethan had walked closer to the model. He looked at it for a long moment, his eyes tracing the lines, assessing the flow of space. He carried a worn, brown leather portfolio with him, as he often did. It was an old habit from his university days, a place to keep his sketchbook and notes. Julian had once sneered at it, calling it his schoolboy's satchel. Inside it now, unseen by the Lockwoods, were preliminary schematics for a project that would dwarf anything Marcus had ever conceived. "The courtyard isn't a waste," Ethan said calmly, his voice even. "It's the lungs of the building. It provides natural light to the interior units, creates a communal space that builds value beyond square footage, and allows for cross-ventilation, reducing energy costs for the entire structure." He pointed to a specific corner. "Removing it will create a dozen dark, undesirable apartments you'll have to sell at a discount, and the rest of the residents will end up paying more in utilities. You're not adding value. You're just adding density at the cost of quality." There was a moment of stunned silence. Ethan had never spoken with such authority in their presence. He had laid out his argument with the precision of an expert, which, of course, he was. Marcus was the first to recover. He let out a short, barking laugh. "My boy, you think on such a small scale. Lungs. We're not building a hospital. We're building wealth. Let the residents pay for their own air conditioning. That's the cost of living in a Lockwood property." Julian smirked, recovering his swagger. "See? A draftsman's concerns. Light and air. How quaint. Leave the big picture to us, Ethan." The ultimate sting, however, came from Ava. She had been standing beside her father, her arm linked through his. When Ethan finished speaking, she didn't look at him. She didn't offer a word of support or acknowledge the validity of his point. Instead, she squeezed her father's arm and smiled up at him. "He's always thinking, Dad. It's what makes him so thoughtful." It was a verbal pat on the head, a dismissal disguised as a compliment. She was managing him, handling him, apologizing for his earnestness in a world that valued only cynical profit. Ethan felt that cut more than any of her father's insults. It was a betrayal of partnership. He had looked at her, hoping to see a flicker of solidarity, a hint of defiance on his behalf. He saw nothing, only the placating smile of a woman desperate to keep the peace, even at the cost of her husband's respect. He had nodded slowly, a deep and profound sadness settling over him. He had zipped his leather portfolio shut. The faint sound was lost in the boisterous laughter of Marcus and Julian as they moved on to boasting about their golf handicaps. But for Ethan, it was the sound of a door closing. He had given her a chance. He had offered his expertise, his truth, and she had stood by and watched her family trample it. That evening, he went home and called David Chun. "It's time," he had said. "Activate the Helios protocol." The humiliation had been a constant, dripping tap. There was the time Julian had accidentally spilled a glass of red wine on a set of blueprints Ethan had brought home, laughing it off as he handed Ethan a $100 bill. "Go get yourself some new paper, buddy." The blueprints had been for a low-income community center he was designing pro bono. Ava had chided Julian, but her anger was for the mess, not the insult. Then there was the Christmas gift. Marcus had given him a set of high-end, gold-plated pens. "For your little drawings," he'd said with a wink. It was a gift that simultaneously acknowledged and belittled his entire profession. Ethan had accepted them with a quiet, "Thank you." Marcus, he kept them in a drawer, a gleaming reminder of their condescension. Through it all, Ethan remained a placid surface. He never argued. He never raised his voice. He absorbed their scorn with a dignity they mistook for weakness. They saw a man who was out of his depth, a simple rowboat bobbing in the wake of their magnificent yacht. They had no idea he was the quiet, unseen captain of a nuclear submarine, gliding silently beneath them, his instruments tracking their every move, his patience a strategic weapon. He was waiting for the perfect moment, not for revenge, but for a reckoning. A moment when the truth would be undeniable, when the structure of their arrogance would collapse under its own weight. And Ava, his beloved Ava, was the silent enabler of it all. She saw the disrespect. She felt it. In her quiet moments with Ethan, she would apologize. "They don't mean it," she'd say. "It's just their way." But Ethan knew it wasn't just their way. It was their belief. They believed they were superior, and she, by her silence, was complicit in that belief. Her love for him was real, but it was conditional, existing only in the private spaces of their life. In public, in the glare of her family's wealth, it was hidden away, too fragile to survive the exposure. He was her secret, just as his true capabilities were a secret from her. The symmetry was both poetic and tragic. He knew that for their marriage to survive, the secrets had to end. All of them. The weeks following the barbecue were a study in contrast. To the Lockwoods, Ethan remained the same. He attended the requisite family dinners, listened to Marcus's monologues, and endured Julian's snide remarks. He was a ghost at their feast, present but unseen. Ava continued her delicate dance, shuttling between her affection for Ethan in their apartment and her deference to her family at their estate. She felt the growing distance between them, but attributed it to his quiet nature, his hurt feelings over the incident at the barbecue. She tried to bridge the gap with expensive gifts and plans for romantic getaways, material solutions for a spiritual problem. But in the small, sunlit office of Vance and Chin Design, a different Ethan emerged. Here, he was not a ghost, but a general. The office, located in a modest, converted warehouse district the Lockwoods would never dream of visiting, was a hive of quiet, intense activity. The name on the door was humble, but it was a front, a deliberate piece of camouflage for a much larger, more powerful entity. Their real firm, known in the highest circles of international architecture and finance, was called Helios Strategic Design. The name never appeared on their letterhead or their door. It existed in encrypted emails, in sealed boardrooms, and in the minds of a very select group of global developers who sought them out for their legendary discretion and visionary, ruthlessly efficient designs. Vance and Chun was their passion project, the place they took on the small, meaningful jobs the Lockwoods would scoff at, the community centers, the public parks, the restorations of historic buildings. Helios was their weapon. It was a boutique consultancy that didn't just design buildings. It structured the deals that made them possible. They didn't just draw blueprints. They rewrote the financial architecture of entire city blocks. David Chun, with his savant-like grasp of market analytics and financial modeling, was the engine. Ethan, with his architectural genius and strategic, long-game vision, was the navigator. The Lockwood portfolio is a house of cards, Ethan, David said one afternoon, pointing to a complex series of charts on a massive monitor. The screen was filled with cascading numbers and projections that would have been unintelligible to Marcus Lockwood, for all his boasting. He's over-leveraged on 3 major projects, including this new Meridian Tower. He's using projected profits from unfinished developments to finance the debt on new acquisitions. A single significant delay, one major zoning denial, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. Ethan stared at the screen, his expression calm. He held one of the gold-plated pens Marcus had given him, turning it over and over in his fingers. The gaudy gift had become a focusing tool, a tangible symbol of the arrogance he was about to dismantle. "He calls it leverage," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "He doesn't understand the difference between leverage and liability. He thinks debt is a tool. He doesn't see it as a chain. He's a predator, but a sloppy one," David continued. "He's gotten away with it for so long because no one has ever called his bluff. His reputation precedes him, and people are intimidated. And his latest move is his most arrogant yet." David pulled up a new set of files. They were architectural renderings, sleek and modern. It was the design for the Meridian Tower, the one Marcus had been boasting about. "Recognize it?" David asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "It's a bastardization of the lighthouse concept." The lighthouse was a design Ethan had worked on years ago, a revolutionary concept for a mixed-use high-rise that integrated sustainable energy systems and public green spaces in a way no one had ever attempted. It was ambitious, brilliant, and years ahead of its time. He had submitted it to a prestigious international competition. It had been a finalist, but hadn't won. The judges had called it too visionary. "His consultant on the inside," David said, his voice laced with contempt, "is a man named Alistair Finch. He was a junior partner at the firm that sponsored the competition. He had access to all the submissions. He left the firm 6 months ago and went to work for Lockwood. He's gutted your design, stripped out all the innovation, the sustainable energy grid, the public access, the structural efficiencies, and left a hollow glass box. He's selling your vision, or the empty shell of it, to Marcus as his own genius." Ethan felt a cold anger, but his face remained a mask of placid control. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just arrogance, it was theft. They were plundering his intellectual property, the very essence of his creative soul, and they were so confident in his perceived weakness that they were doing it right in front of his face. "And the zoning variants?" Ethan asked. David smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "That's the beautiful part. The variance Finch and Lockwood are counting on is predicated on a series of environmental impact exemptions. Those exemptions are only granted for designs that meet the city's highest green standard certification. Their stripped-down version doesn't even come close. But the application was filed using altered data lifted directly from your original lighthouse submission. It's fraud, plain and simple. They're building their monument on a foundation of lies." This was the linchpin. This was the fatal flaw in Marcus's grand design. His arrogance had made him blind, and his greed had made him reckless. He had put his entire empire at risk on the word of a thief, never imagining that the man whose work they were stealing was sitting at his own dinner table. "And what about the land, David?" Ethan asked. The critical parcel Marcus was so proud of securing. David's smile widened. He brought up a new screen, a map showing the proposed footprint of the Meridian Tower. One parcel was highlighted in red. This one, the keystone. Without it, the entire project is unbuildable. Marcus bought it through a shell corporation 3 weeks ago for 20% above market value. He thinks he outsmarted everyone. "Who was the seller?" Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. David typed a few commands. A company name appeared on the screen. Chesapeake Holdings, LLC. He then typed another command, and the ownership structure of Chesapeake Holdings appeared. It was a single name, Ethan Vance. For the past year, through David, Ethan had been quietly acquiring key, underutilized properties in that district. He had seen the development potential long before Marcus had, but his vision was different. It was sustainable, community-focused, and structurally sound. When he learned through his network that Lockwood was sniffing around, he had set the trap. He had allowed Marcus's shell corporation to buy the one piece of land he was willing to part with, an inflated price, knowing it was the bait that would lead the entire Lockwood empire to its ruin. "He paid you a $20 million premium for the shovel to dig his own grave," David said. Ethan looked at the screen, at the intricate web of deceit and hubris spun by Marcus Lockwood. He felt no triumph, only a grim sense of necessity. This was not a game. It was a correction, a rebalancing of the scales. He picked up his old leather portfolio from his desk. He ran his hand over the worn cover. It had been a gift from his father when he'd started architecture school. Never forget the basics, his father had told him. A good foundation, honest materials, a design that serves people. Inside, he kept the original, hand-drawn sketches for the lighthouse project. He also kept the deed for the land he had sold to Marcus and the complete, unalterable blockchain record of his original design submission, time-stamped years before Alastair Finch had ever heard of Marcus Lockwood. He carried the proof of their downfall with him to their dinner table, a quiet, symbolic weight they could never comprehend. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Ava. "Dinner at Dad's tonight. 7:30. Please try to be pleasant." Ethan looked at the message. Pleasant. She was still trying to manage him, to smooth his edges to fit into her family's polished world. She had no idea that he was about to shatter that world forever. "It's tonight," Ethan said to David. "He's announcing the final stage of funding for Meridian at a press dinner next month. But the family dinner is tonight. Are you ready?" David asked. Ethan stood up and looked out the window of his modest office. He could see the gleaming, distant towers of the financial district, the world Marcus Lockwood thought he owned. "Patience is a form of action," Ethan said, a phrase he often used. "We've been patient long enough." He slipped the gold pen into his pocket. "It's time for them to see what a real foundation looks like." The final humiliation was staged, as all Lockwood triumphs were, for maximum effect. It took place not at the dinner table, but a week later at the family's country club. It was the club's annual summer gala, a festival of pastel linens and quiet, competitive wealth. Ethan had tried to beg off, but Ava had been insistent. "It's important to Dad," she'd said. "He's making a sort of pre-announcement about the Meridian project to his inner circle. He wants the family there." So Ethan stood in a tuxedo that felt like a costume, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, watching Marcus Lockwood command the center of the room. A small crowd of investors and local dignitaries had gathered around him. Marcus was in his element, his voice booming with the easy confidence of a man who had never known failure. "It's more than a building," he declared, raising his glass. "It's a statement, a new icon for our city, a testament to what vision and courage can achieve." Julian, standing at his father's side, spotted Ethan hovering at the edge of the circle. A malicious grin spread across his face. He saw an opportunity for sport. "Ethan," he called out, his voice loud enough to draw the group's attention. "Come over here. My father is talking about vision. You're a creative type. You should hear this." The circle parted to let Ethan through. He felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him, assessing him. He was Ava Lockwood's quiet husband, the odd, unimpressive man she had inexplicably married. He nodded a polite greeting. "Ethan is an architect himself," Marcus announced to the group, a paternalistic smile plastered on his face. It was the same tone one might use to say, "My son has a charming little lemonade stand." A very careful and methodical one. An older man in the circle, a banker named Peterson whom Ethan knew by reputation, chuckled. "Careful and methodical doesn't get a skyscraper built, Marcus." "Precisely," Marcus boomed. "That's why he sticks to his smaller projects. But we all have a role to play." He then placed a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. "In fact, I've been meaning to talk to you, son. Once the Meridian is underway, we'll have a massive facilities management department. I could find a place for you there. Good, steady work. A real career path. It would be a step up for you." The offer hung in the air, thick with condescension. It was a public act of charity, a king bestowing a favor upon a court jester. He was offering Ethan a job as a glorified building manager in a structure built from the stolen remnants of his own genius. The insult was so profound, so layered, that it was almost a work of art. Ethan looked at the faces around him. He saw pity, amusement, and dismissal. He then looked for Ava. She was standing just outside the circle, her face a mask of strained neutrality. She had heard the offer. She had seen the humiliation. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and in them he saw a silent plea. "Just take it. Just smile and say thank you. Don't make a scene." This was the moment, the final test. Her loyalty, his dignity, their entire future hung in the balance of his response. The quiet before the storm descended. Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. Everything slowed down. He could hear the distant chatter from the other side of the ballroom, the faint strains of the string quartet, the ice shifting in his glass. He was acutely aware of the weight of Marcus's hand on his shoulder, a physical manifestation of the man's suffocating ego. He turned his head slightly to look at Marcus. He didn't shrug off the hand. He simply let it rest there, an anchor for the moment. "Thank you, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice perfectly level. "That's a very generous offer." Relief washed over Ava's face. Marcus beamed, his magnanimity affirmed. Julian smirked, his victory complete. Ethan had bent the knee. "But I'm afraid I'll have to decline," Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. The smile on Marcus's face froze. The atmosphere shifted. "I'm not sure I'd have the time," Ethan said, as if explaining a scheduling conflict. "My firm, Helios Strategic Design, has just been awarded the lead on the Chandler Point waterfront development. It's a rather demanding project." The name landed like a stone in a silent pond. Chandler Point. It was the most coveted development project on the continent, a multi-billion-dollar undertaking that had been the subject of intense speculation for months. The firms competing for it were the titans of the industry, global giants from London, Tokyo, and Dubai. Peterson, the banker, was the first to speak, his voice a disbelieving whisper. "Helios? You're with Helios? I thought they were a Swiss consortium." "A common misconception," Ethan said calmly. "We value our privacy." He finally turned his full attention to Marcus, whose hand had fallen from his shoulder as if it had been burned. The paternalistic smile had been replaced by a look of profound confusion. "Chandler Point has a very aggressive timeline and a rather complex foundation. We can't afford any compromises." He used the word again. Compromises. A direct echo of their dinner conversation. A warning shot across the bow. The circle around them was silent. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been inverted with the force of a tidal wave. Ethan was no longer the court jester. He was a player in a game so far above theirs that they hadn't even known it was being played. Marcus stared at him, his mind reeling. "Helios, I've never heard of you." It was a weak attempt to reclaim control, to dismiss what he couldn't comprehend. "I know," Ethan said, and in those two simple words, he conveyed everything. "You don't move in the circles I do. You don't have the access. You are not my peer." He then looked past Marcus, his gaze finding Ava. She was frozen, her hand covering her mouth. Her face, which had been a mask of strained peace, was now a canvas of pure shock. The man she had been apologizing for, the man she had been protecting her family from, the man she had just silently pleaded with to accept a demeaning handout, was one of the most powerful figures in his industry. Her husband was not the man she thought he was, and the life she thought was secure was built on a lie she had helped to perpetuate. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, his expression not of triumph, but of deep, sorrowful regret. He had been forced to reveal himself this way. Her complicity had left him no other choice. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned and walked away from the stunned circle, leaving a crater of silence in the middle of the ballroom. He didn't need to stay to watch the fallout. The fuse had been lit. The official press conference for the Meridian Tower was scheduled for 1 month after the Country Club Gala. To Ethan's astonishment, Marcus Lockwood decided to proceed. It was an act of supreme, almost pathological arrogance. In the intervening weeks, the name Helios Strategic Design and its connection to the Chandler Point project had become the biggest news in the development world. The whispers about Ethan Vance had started, quiet first, then growing in volume. People were trying to connect the dots between the quiet man married to Ava Lockwood and the mysterious principal of the world's most exclusive design and strategy firm. For Marcus, to back down now would be to admit defeat, to concede that the quiet man he had patronized for 2 years held some power over him. His pride would not allow it. He doubled down. He told his investors that Ethan's claims were an exaggeration, the boast of a small-timer who had gotten lucky with one project. He convinced himself that Ethan's warning about the compromised foundation was just a bizarre, metaphorical threat from a man lashing out. He pushed his team harder, rushing the final funding approvals, leaning on his political contacts to expedite the fraudulent zoning variants. Ava, meanwhile, was living in a state of suspended disbelief. The gala had shattered her reality. She had tried to talk to Ethan, to confront him, but she didn't even know what questions to ask. Helios, she had asked him the night of the gala, her voice trembling. Chandler Point? Ethan, what is going on? It's my work? Ava, he had said simply, his voice devoid of accusation. It's what I do. But, Vance and Shun, the little office? The pro bono work. That's my work too, he said. It's the work I love. Helios is the work that's necessary. She couldn't understand. The cognitive dissonance was too great. For 2 years, she had curated an image of him in her mind. Gentle, kind, brilliant in his own small way, but ultimately, someone who needed her family's protection and largesse. To reconcile that image with the man who could casually announce his leadership of a multi-billion-dollar project was impossible. So she didn't. She retreated into denial, telling herself it was a misunderstanding, a fluke. She clung to the hope that her father was right, that Ethan had simply overstated his role. Her desperation to believe in the world she knew was stronger than her ability to accept the truth that was staring her in the face. The day of the press conference arrived. It was held in the grand ballroom of a 5-star hotel. A stage was set up with a large screen behind it, displaying a gleaming rendering of the Meridian Tower. The room was filled with journalists, investors, city officials, and the cream of the city's business community. The Lockwoods, Marcus, Eleanor, and Julian, sat in the front row, glowing with triumph. Ava sat with them, her smile as fragile as spun glass. She had pleaded with Ethan not to come, but he had insisted. I'm a member of the family, he'd said. I should be there to support you. He took a seat in the back row, a quiet observer, his old leather portfolio resting on his lap. Marcus took the stage to a round of applause. He was radiant, his voice resonating with power and victory. He spoke of legacy, of vision, of the bold future his family was building for the city. The Meridian Tower will be more than a landmark, he proclaimed. It will be the new heart of our financial district, a beacon of prosperity. And it has been designed by a visionary team, led by the brilliant Alastair Finch. He gestured to the side, and Finch, a man with nervous eyes and an expensive suit, walked onto the stage to polite applause. As Finch began to speak, describing the innovative features of the design, a man in a simple gray suit entered the ballroom from a side door and handed a single file folder to a journalist from the city's leading financial paper. The man in the gray suit was David Chun. Marcus then moved to the climax of his presentation. And I am thrilled to announce that the final round of funding is now complete. Our partners have shown immense faith in this project, and the city has been a tremendous supporter, granting us the zoning variances necessary to achieve our ambitious vision. As he spoke, the large screen behind him, which was supposed to be showing a celebratory video, flickered. The gleaming image of the Meridian Tower vanished, replaced by a simple, split-screen display. On the left side was a detailed architectural schematic, labeled the Lighthouse Project. Submitted by Ethan Vance, 19-inch on the right side, was an identical schematic, stripped of its key features, labeled Meridian Tower. Submitted by Alastair Finch for Lockwood Development, 2023-inch red lines highlighted the dozens of identical, unique data points between the two designs. Below them, a date-stamped, blockchain-verified registration number for Ethan's original design appeared. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Marcus froze, his smile dissolving. He stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. Finch turned pale, looking like a cornered animal. There seems to be a technical glitch, Marcus stammered, trying to regain control. There's no glitch, Marcus. The voice came from the back of the room. It was calm, clear, and amplified by a small microphone no one had seen before. Ethan Vance was now standing, his portfolio under one arm. David Chun stood beside him, holding a small, professional-grade audio device. Every head in the room turned. That is my design, Ethan said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. My intellectual property. a design that Mr. Finch and Lockwood Development have stolen, stripped for parts, and are now attempting to build on a foundation of fraud. Panic erupted in the front row. Julian leaped to his feet. That's slander. Security. It's not slander if it's true. Julian, Ethan replied, his gaze unblinking. He began to walk slowly down the central aisle toward the stage. The crowd parted for him as if he were a biblical prophet. The zoning variance you're so proud of, Marcus, Ethan continued, his voice a lesson in calm destruction, was granted based on fraudulent environmental data lifted directly from my original, truly sustainable design. The design you're actually planning to build does not qualify. As of 10 minutes ago, a formal complaint has been filed with the city's planning commission. Your variance is void. A gasp went through the room. The journalist who had received the folder from David was already on his phone, dictating the story of the century. Furthermore, Ethan said, now standing at the foot of the stage, looking up at the two men whose world was collapsing, the entire financial structure of this project is predicated on that variance. Without it, your construction permits are invalid. Your insurance bonds are nullified, and your loan agreements are in default. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He looked at the investors in the front row, men who had staked their reputations on Marcus Lockwood's Midas touch. I would advise any of you with capital tied up in this project to call your lawyers. Lockwood Development is functionally insolvent. He then turned his gaze to Alastair Finch, who was visibly trembling. And Mr. Finch, industrial espionage and intellectual property theft carry significant legal penalties. The firm you stole the design from is also preparing a multi-hundred-million-dollar lawsuit. I believe the papers will be served before you leave this room. Finally, he looked at Marcus. The king was off his throne. He stood on the stage, diminished and exposed, his face a mask of apoplectic rage and utter disbelief. You built your career on taking things, Marcus, Ethan said, his voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with the quiet authority of a judge delivering a verdict. You took land, you took advantage of people, and this time, you took my work. You were so sure of my weakness, so dismissive of my worth, that you never once considered that I might be able to defend myself. Ethan unzipped his old leather portfolio. He didn't pull out blueprints or contracts. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a deed. And the final piece of your puzzle, he said, holding it up, the keystone parcel of land, the one you were so proud of acquiring through your shell company. You bought it from me, and you bought it with a reversionary clause in the title, triggered by any finding of fraudulent activity connected to the development. As of this moment, ownership of that land reverts to me. Your project is not just insolvent. It is, and always was, impossible. He placed the deed back in his portfolio and zipped it shut. The sound echoed through the ballroom, a final, definitive note. The Meridian Tower was dead. The Lockwood Empire was a ruin, and it had all been dismantled in under 5 minutes by the quiet, unassuming man they had dismissed as a hobbyist. Ethan looked one last time at the front row, at Eleanor, whose face was a crumpled mess of social horror, at Julian, who was staring at him with a mixture of hatred and dawning, terrified respect, and at Ava. She was not looking at her father. She was staring at her husband, the stranger who stood before her. The depth of his planning, the quiet, patient totality of his response, was terrifying and magnificent. He had absorbed every insult, every slight, and transformed them into fuel for this perfectly executed, devastatingly complete reckoning. The foundation was compromised. He had told them, and now he had brought the whole house down. The immediate aftermath was chaos rendered in silence. The grand ballroom, moments before a stage for triumph, became a tomb. The flash of cameras was frantic, a desperate attempt to capture the exact moment an empire died. Journalists were on their phones, their voices hushed but urgent, dictating headlines that would obliterate the Lockwood name by morning. Investors, their faces grim, huddled in tight, panicked circles, their loyalty to Marcus evaporating in real time. On the stage, Marcus Lockwood stood as if turned to stone, his face a mottled canvas of purple and white. The booming voice was gone. replaced by a choked, rasping sound. Alistair Finch, seeing two stern-faced men in dark suits approaching him from the wings, made a desperate, scrambling exit through a back curtain, a rat fleeing a sinking ship. Ethan did not stay to watch. He had delivered the verdict. He had no interest in presiding over the execution. He turned and walked back up the aisle, the crowd parting for him once more, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and morbid curiosity. He reached the back of the ballroom and, without a backward glance, pushed through the doors and into the quiet hallway. He had taken only a few steps when he heard her voice. "Ethan." It was Ava. She had run from the front row, her face streaked with tears, her expression wild. She caught up to him, grabbing his arm. Her touch was not gentle. It was desperate, accusatory. "How could you?" she gasped, her voice ragged. "How would you do this to them? To my family?" Ethan stopped and turned to face her. He looked at her, at the woman he loved, the woman who had stood by and watched him be humiliated time and again, and now accused him of cruelty for finally defending himself. The tragic irony was not lost on him. "I did this," he asked, his voice quiet but firm, holding up the moral mirror. "Ava, I did nothing but tell the truth. Your father's empire was a fantasy built on debt and deceit. His latest project was built on theft. Your brother's pride was built on cruelty. What exactly did I destroy that was real?" "You humiliated them," she cried, her voice echoing in the empty corridor. "In front of everyone. My father, you've ruined him. Your father ruined himself." Ethan corrected her gently. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't see the cliff he was driving his own family toward. "I just put up a roadblock before he could take anyone else down with him." He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I tried to warn him, Ava. In your dining room. I told him the foundation was compromised. He didn't listen." "Warn him?" She shot back, her grief turning to anger. "You spoke in riddles. You set a trap. This whole time, Helios, Chandler Point, selling him the land. You were planning this. For how long, Ethan? For how long have you been lying to me?" It was the accusation he had been expecting, the one that hurt the most. "I have never lied to you, Ava," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of her misunderstanding. "I have only ever been myself. You're the one who couldn't see me. You and your family. You created a version of me that you were comfortable with, the quiet, harmless, thoughtful man who wouldn't rock the boat. You never bothered to look any deeper. You never asked." The truth of his words struck her, but she was too lost in her loyalty to her family's pain to accept it. "So this is my fault? I'm to blame for you bankrupting my father." "This isn't about blame," Ethan said, his patience wearing thin. "It's about choice. For 2 years, I have watched your family treat me with contempt. And for 2 years, you have stood by and let them. You made a choice, Ava. You chose their comfort over my dignity. Every single time." He cataloged the grievances, not with anger, but with the sad precision of an auditor. "When your mother replaced my engagement ring, you said nothing. When Julian destroyed my blueprints, you apologized for the mess. When your father offered me a janitorial job in a building he was stealing from me, you begged me with your eyes to accept the humiliation. You asked me to be small so they could feel big. What choice did that leave me?" She stared at him, speechless. Every word was true. She had been the silent enabler, the guardian of a fragile peace that came at the cost of his soul. Her tears were not just for her family's downfall, but for the dawning, horrifying realization of her own complicity. "I love you," she whispered, the words a desperate last defense. "I know," he said, and the sadness in his voice was profound. "I love you too. But love can't survive without respect, Ava. And respect is something your family demands, but never gives. It's something you are willing to sacrifice. The question is, what are you going to do now? Now that the facade is gone, and all that's left is the truth." He didn't wait for an answer. He gently removed her hand from his arm, turned, and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long, empty hall. He left her standing there, alone, in the wreckage of 2 families. The one she was born into, which had just been exposed as a fraud, and the one she had chosen, whose true strength she had never bothered to understand. The choice was now hers. She could cling to the ruins of her father's fallen kingdom, or she could try to build something new, something real, on a foundation of honesty and respect. The days that followed were a brutal, public autopsy of the Lockwood Empire. The story Ethan had detonated at the press conference was a supernova. Every major news outlet picked it up, replaying the video of Ethan's calm, systematic takedown. The words "compromise foundation" became a meme, a shorthand for hubris meeting its match. Marcus Lockwood's fall was as swift as it was total. The default on the Meridian loan triggered a cascade of cross-defaults across his entire portfolio. The bankers and investors who had toasted his genius now treated him like a leper, calling in debts and backing out of deals. The SEC launched a formal investigation into the fraudulent zoning application. The international firm, whose competition Alastair Finch had judged, announced their massive lawsuit for intellectual property theft. Within a week, Lockwood Development, the monument to Marcus's ego, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The king was dethroned, his kingdom liquidated for parts. Julian, stripped of his trust fund and the protective shield of his father's name, was lost. He had no skills, no experience, no concept of a world that didn't bend to his will. His arrogant smirk was replaced by a look of bewildered panic. He tried calling his influential friends, but his calls went unanswered. He was a social pariah, the son of a disgraced fraud. Eleanor suffered a different, but no less devastating, fate. Her world was built on the foundation of social standing and appearances. With a Lockwood name now synonymous with disgrace, she was exiled. Invitations to galas and charity boards stopped arriving. The friends she had cultivated for decades now crossed the street to avoid her. She retreated into the family's mortgaged mansion, a queen trapped in a castle whose walls were crumbling around her. The poetic justice was inescapable. Marcus, who had built his empire on a foundation of lies, saw it collapse for that very reason. Julian, who had never worked a day in his life, was now faced with the prospect of finding a job. Eleanor, who had prized appearances above all else, was now a figure of public shame. They had underestimated Ethan based on superficial assessments, and their downfall came from their complete inability to see the substance beneath the surface. And Ava was caught in the epicenter. She returned to the mansion to be with her family, a daughter's reflexive act of loyalty. But the atmosphere was toxic. Her father, a broken and bitter man, raged against Ethan, calling him a snake, a monster, a traitor. He refused to accept any responsibility, casting himself as the victim of a meticulous, cruel conspiracy. Julian echoed his father's sentiments, his fear manifesting as venomous hatred for the man who had exposed his inadequacy. Ava found herself defending Ethan, a role she had never before played. "He told you, Dad," she said during one of Marcus's tirades. "At dinner, he said the foundation was compromised. He tried to warn you." A cryptic insult. Marcus roared. "Not a warning. He wanted this. He wanted to destroy me." "Why?" Ava asked, the question genuine. "What did he have to gain? He's the head of Helios. He's building Chandler Point. He doesn't need your money. He didn't do this for profit. He did it for spite." Julian spat. "Because we never bowed down to him." The sheer absurdity of the statement struck Ava. Bowed down to him? They had treated him like dirt. The moral mirror that Ethan had held up to her was now reflecting her family back at her, and the image was grotesque. She saw their blindness, their utter lack of self-awareness. They truly believed they were the aggrieved party. She began to spend less time at the mansion and more time alone in the apartment she had shared with Ethan. It was quiet, empty. His clothes were still in the closet, his books on the nightstand. She found the gold-plated pins Marcus had given him, sitting in his desk drawer. She picked one up, feeling its obscene weight. A gift meant to belittle, now a relic of a fallen empire. She thought about Ethan's words. "You asked me to be small so they could feel big." The truth of it was a physical ache in her chest. She had been so afraid of her family's disapproval that she had policed her own husband's identity. She had participated in his erasure. Her greatest sin was not her silence. It was her active collaboration in their delusion. One evening, she found a small, locked box in his desk. Her first instinct, the old Ava's instinct, was to respect his privacy. The new Ava, the one emerging from the wreckage, knew she no longer had that luxury. She needed to understand. She found the key and opened it. Inside was not more evidence of his wealth or power. It was filled with mementos of their life together. The ticket stubs from their first movie, a dried flower from the park where he proposed, a menu from the simple Italian restaurant they went to on their first anniversary, and dozens of small, intricate pencil sketches of her. Not formal portraits, but candid moments. Ava reading a book, Ava laughing, Ava asleep, her hair fanned out on the pillow. They were rendered with a love and attention to detail that was breathtaking. He saw her. In all her moments, big and small, he had truly seen her. At the bottom of the box was a single, folded piece of architectural drafting paper. She unfolded it. It was a beautiful, elegant sketch of a house. It was modern but warm, with clean lines, vast windows, and a design that seemed to merge seamlessly with the landscape around it. In the bottom corner, in Ethan's precise script, were the words, "Our house. Someday." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the drawing. This was his dream. Not skyscrapers or stock prices. A home. With her. All the pain he had endured, all the insults he had absorbed, he had done it while holding this quiet dream in his heart. And she had been oblivious. The choice became clear. She could stay with her family, tending to their bitter wounds and propping up their self-pity, or she could try to become a woman worthy of the man who drew this house. It was the easiest and the hardest decision of her life. 3 months passed. The autumn chill began to settle over the city. The name Lockwood had faded from the headlines, replaced by breathless coverage of the Chandler Point development. Helio's strategic design, once a shadowy enigma, was now hailed as the future of urban planning. Their focus on sustainability, community integration, and long-term value was being celebrated as a paradigm shift. Ethan Vance, the firm's quiet, brilliant principal, became a reluctant icon. He gave few interviews, but when he spoke of responsibility, of building for people, not for profit. The Lockwood mansion was sold at auction. Marcus and Eleanor moved into a small, rented condominium, the opulent furniture replaced by stark, unfamiliar pieces. The come-down was brutal. Marcus, without his power, was a ghost. He spent his days staring out the window, replaying his downfall, a bitter old man with nothing but his grievances. Eleanor, stripped of her social standing, withered. Julian, to everyone's surprise, got a job. He started at the bottom, as a trainee in a logistics company, a position secured for him by a distant cousin who took pity on him. The work was hard, the pay was minimal, and his superiors did not care that his name was Lockwood. For the first time in his life, he was judged not by his name, but by his performance. The first few weeks were a nightmare of entitlement and frustration. But then, slowly, something began to shift. The daily grind, the necessity of earning his own keep, began to chip away at the layers of arrogance. He was still sullen and resentful, but for the first time, a sliver of the real world was getting through. Ava did not see them often. She had made her choice. After finding the sketch of the house, she had packed a single bag and left the apartment. She didn't go to a hotel. She rented a small, simple room in a part of the city she barely knew and got a job. Not a high-powered job befitting a Lockwood, but a position at a nonprofit that helped resettle refugee families. The work was humbling, difficult, and emotionally taxing. She spent her days navigating bureaucracy, finding housing, and helping people who had lost everything start over. She saw real hardship, real resilience. Her family's fall from grace, which had seemed so catastrophic, now felt like a petty drama in comparison. Her own self-pity dissolved in the face of true suffering and true strength. She was no longer Ava Lockwood. She was just Ava. She learned to listen. She learned to see people not for their status or their connections, but for who they were. She was, in a sense, rebuilding herself from the foundation up, using honest materials. She did not contact Ethan. She knew that an apology was meaningless without change, and she was not yet the woman she needed to be. Words were easy. Action was hard. She owed him the hard part. One day, she was at a community center in a low-income neighborhood, helping to coordinate a food drive. She was sorting cans of soup when she saw a framed plaque on the wall. It read, "This center was designed and built with the generous support of Vance and Chun Design. A community is built on a foundation of care." She stared at the plaque, her heart aching. This was his other work. The work he loved. The work her family had mocked. He had been building communities while her father was building monuments to his own ego. As she stood there, a man walked up beside her. "It's a good building," he said. "Solid. Serves the people well." She turned. It was Ethan. He looked the same, but different. Calmer. The weight he had been carrying for 2 years was gone. He was not there by accident. David Chun, who had kept a discreet, distant eye on Ava, had told him where she was. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello, Ava," he said. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were kind. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the busy community center swirling around them. "I'm sorry," she said finally. The words were small, inadequate for the chasm that had opened between them, but they were all she had. "For everything. For my silence. For my blindness. For not being the partner you deserved." He nodded slowly. "I know you are. I understand now," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "What you did, it wasn't revenge. It was a correction. You didn't tear them down. You just stopped holding them up. You let gravity do the rest." He was impressed by her perception. She had finally understood. They built their world on a fault line. Ava, it was always going to collapse. "I just chose the time and place to make sure no one else got hurt." "I know," she said. She looked around the bustling room, at the people being helped, at the tangible good being done. "This is real. What you do here, what my family did, it was a fantasy. I was living in a fantasy." She finally looked him directly in the eye, her gaze clear and steady for the first time. "I don't want to live there anymore." Ethan saw the change in her. It was in her eyes, in the way she held herself. The brittle, defensive pride of the Lockwoods was gone, replaced by a quiet, humble strength. She was no longer defined by her family's name, but by her own actions. She had done the hard work. She had rebuilt herself. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He didn't pull out a contract or a blueprint. He pulled out his old, worn leather portfolio. He held it out to her. "There's something I want to show you," he said. Her hand trembled as she took it. It felt heavier than she expected, weighted with history and meaning. She unzipped it. Inside, right on top, was the sketch of the house. "Our house. Someday." She looked from a sketch to his face, a question in her eyes. "The site is ready," he said softly. "The foundation is sound, but a house is just a structure. It's not a home without the people inside it." He paused, his heart in his eyes. "I can't build it alone." The choice was hers. The final, most important one. He was not demanding or commanding. He was offering an invitation to build something new together on a foundation of truth, respect, and hard-won wisdom. Ava looked at the drawing, at the beautiful home that represented not just his dream, but a future she now desperately wanted. A future she was finally ready for. A tear fell onto the paper, a small, perfect drop of water on the blueprint of their new life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Ethan. Let's go home." And so, the story ends not with the satisfying crash of a vengeful victory, but with the quiet, hopeful work of rebuilding. It reminds us that true strength isn't about dominance or power, but about integrity and patience. It's about knowing your own worth, even when the world refuses to see it. The most satisfying victories aren't the ones where we crush our enemies, but the ones where we reclaim our dignity and, in doing so, open the door for redemption, both for ourselves and for those who have wronged us. What do you think? Is forgiveness possible without accountability? Can someone like Ava truly change? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective makes these stories so much richer. If you found this journey meaningful, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and remember, a solid foundation can withstand any storm.